Hi, welcome to the Philip Marlowe Trouble is His Business PowerPoint movie. Marlowe is one of the great fictional creations of the 20th century. He's appeared in 7 novels, 21 short stories, and these have been adapted on radio, television, and film. The short stories that he appeared in from 1933 to 1939 were collected in a book called Trouble Is My Business in 1950. That's where I get the title from for this little show. And what Chandler did later in 1950 in those short stories was he went back and changed the detective's name to Marlowe. Sometimes the detective had a different name, Mallory, or didn't have a name at all. But it's really the prototypical Philip Marlowe in those stories that he creates in full in the 1939 novel, The Big Sleep. This is a vivid character, and he has resonated with the public for the last 75 odd years. People seem to be able to relate to him. He served as the prototype for every wisecracking private eye, cop, tough guy, hero, soldier over the last several decades. You'll notice there on the left, that's a recent edition of The Big Sleep. And in the far left-hand corner there, you'll see the introduction is by Ian Rankin. He's another murder mystery writer. Police procedurals. John Rebus is his Edinburgh detective, and he's a direct literary descendant of Marlowe, a detective who drinks too much, has trouble with bosses and superiors and everybody else, but somehow manages to get the job done, even though he's rather dysfunctional, let's say. We're fortunate enough to have some comments about the character from the writer himself. If you recall, in The Simple Art of Murder, Chandler talks about who this character is and how different he is from the Golden Age detectives like Hercule Poirot or like Sherlock Holmes. So Marlowe is certainly hard-boiled. And that's because the time in the world he lives in is hard-boiled. He's a product of the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, even though he endures into ours. And this time in America, there's gang violence, there's police corruption, organized crime, illegal gambling, sexual perversion, all kinds of things are going on. The world that Marlowe lives in was mean. It was filled with a lot of dangerous men and women. And in The Big Sleep, you'll notice there are 6 deaths. There's a rather high murder count, body count. And there's things like blackmail, robbery, a smut shop, stolen car workshop, racketeering, drugs going on in the book. Crime seems to run rampant in L.A. It's a lawless land. But he thinks that Marlowe is not tarnished, dirtied, or corrupted by it, or afraid of who or what he meets on his journeys. What do we know about Marlowe? Pretty much everything he tells General Sternwood early on in the book. He's a young man, fairly tall, although the irony is that Humphrey Bogart in the movie is quite short, kind of Tom Cruise, Johnny Depp kind of height. Marlowe's got a medium build. He's pretty good looking. He's a smooth talker, and he is single until the last book that Chandler writes, in which he gets married in Payback. And then in the unfinished book that was later completed in Poodle Springs, he's still married to Linda Loring. Marlowe has some interesting habits, let's say. He tends to drink a lot. He's often nursing some kind of hangover. Um, as he says in chapter 9, I woke up with a motorman's glove in my mouth. So he's pretty dry that morning. He does smoke cigarettes and pipes. He's hardly a dandy. Usually his suits are either blue or dark gray. He knows how to play chess. He's a good player. And he says to General Sternwood, I can still speak English if there's a demand for it. So he has some education, but he's known to be savvy in the street. He can handle himself with the general, with the police, with the mob. So he's clever and he's curious. Although you'll notice he says he tends not to take divorce cases. Wonder why? Well, probably because they're too emotional and complicated. So think of him as a man's man, a real macho, rough and tough guy. That's a movie poster there from 1969. In the background is James Garner, who later became even more famous for the Rockford Files TV show, playing that private eye. Here he's playing Marlowe. And you can tell it's a 1960s film. Look at the numbers there, 1, 2, 3. The number 1 says, this is Philip Marlowe's whiskey. It makes courage. Number 2 says, this is Philip Marlowe's gun. It makes noise. And then number 3 says, this is Philip Marlowe's friend. It makes love. Welcome to Marlowe country. Yeah, interesting late 60s adaptation there. For those of you who are curious, Marlowe tends to like whiskey and gimlets, which is a gin drink. So maybe the next time you're out, you could try these. Although in the books, Marlowe isn't going to turn down any kind of drink that's offered, whether it's beer, wine, vodka. He does enjoy his alcohol. We also know that Marlowe did work for the district attorney's office in Los Angeles. That's D.A. Wilde that we meet in this book. But however, he is fired for insubordination, which means he probably didn't always obey orders that he was giving, and he probably talked back to his superiors. He's got a small apartment in L.A. He's really poor by choice. He's got a car in which in the glove compartment, he likes to keep a gun and a bottle of rye in it. He's often at odds with the police. He has a real love-hate relationship with them. The only friend he really has on the police force is Bernie Olds. Marlowe sort of knows that they're probably corrupt and their methods are certainly brutal. And he has a great line in chapter 2 when he says, I'm unmarried because I don't like policemen's wives. Yeah, lots of irony there. And a fantastic closing line there in The Long Goodbye about the police. I never saw any of them again, except the cops. No way has yet been invented to say goodbye to them. So he's always running in with the police who are questioning him and suspicious of him. So he's not often working with them as much as he is working against them. That's a picture there on the screen of Dick Powell, who got to play Philip Marlowe in a screen adaptation of Farewell My Lovely in 1944. It was called Murder My Sweet. And he was an unusual choice to play Marlowe, because he was pretty much a light romantic comedy song and dance guy. So they were really working against typecasting and stereotyping there. But he did a great job in it. He starred opposite Claire Trevor, if you remember from the Femme Fatale PowerPoint. Marlowe's his own boss. He's an independent businessman. And he can't afford a secretary. Usually his offices are in kind of low-rent, greasy places, run down, empty, a kind of sordid office space, let's say. And he tries to keep his independence, really, for thought and action. Like I said, he's poor by choice. As you notice, he says to the Sternwoods he gets $25 a day, which back in the late 30s would have been well above the average. But Marlowe certainly isn't getting rich off his work. That's an image there of the Cuyahoga building in Los Angeles. That's where Marlowe's office was, supposedly. And the intersection there in Hollywood Boulevard, the city decided to name it Raymond Chandler Intersection in honor of Marlowe and the character and the author, excuse me. Marlowe does have weapons. He's got a Luger, a Colt, and a .38 Special. But he's not trigger happy. In fact, he really only kills one person in all the stories and novels, and that's in this one. Marlowe would much prefer to use his brains and wits and use words to defeat his enemies. Um, if you recall what he says to Joe Brody, so many guns in this city and so little brains. If you're looking at how Marlowe effectively uses language, have a look at chapter 13 when he meets Eddie Mars, and he and Mars try to hard-boil each other back and forth through that chapter. Marlowe's a decent guy, and this is unusual in hard-boiled stories. He's dependable and trustworthy and ethical. He won't do everything just to get the job done, like a lot of other hard-boiled detectives of the 20s and 30s. So he's a bit more nuanced and complex in his behavior and emotions. He's very protective about his clients and giving out information about them to other people like Vivian or the police. He's a little bit on the arrogant side. And even though he's a tough guy, he's certainly vulnerable. He can get personally involved in cases and feel the pain of others. But by and large, he tries to stay outside, like a lone wolf, a rather solitary, isolated, and alienated figure. And really what makes him so unique is the rather biting, ironic, comic dialogue that comes out of his mouth. Very muscular, very direct. And he's certainly not politically correct. As you notice in this novel, he's has racist comments, sexist comments, homophobic comments. That's what makes him so paradoxical. He has these flaws. And on the other side, he's rather sentimental and philosophical and contemplative and reflective at points. That's a picture there of the scene when he first meets Vivian, and that's an interesting battle again between the two characters when she goes at him and he gives it right back to her. He won't put up with any of her nonsense. Now, one of the most important things about Marlowe is his code of chivalry. And chivalry is essentially a set of customs and rituals that are connected with medieval knighthood. Think of the Knights of King Arthur and the Round Table. And it would have involved things like being loyal to a king, showing fidelity to your lady love, fighting monsters, giants, tyrants, and being ready to aid the victims of injustice anywhere. An all-round good guy. Because as I mentioned, most private eyes in the fictional world of the 20s and 30s would do whatever it took to get the job done. They'd lie, they'd cheat, they'd steal. They were just as bad as the criminals and the cops in a lot of ways. So throughout this book, you'll see a knight motif running through it, and it probably has a lot to do with Chandler's British public school education. They say he's not going to steal money. He's not going to accept insolence without fighting back, and he's not going to be revengeful either. He's going to treat people as they treat him. He's not out for personal gain. In fact, he's usually being punished economically, if not physically. And you'll notice that he meets an awful lot of interesting characters that he has to contend with. The general, wealthy women, the police, gangsters, all the way through. And you'll notice that later in the novel, he remarks to the general that he's not like Sherlock Holmes or Philo Vance. A really interesting moment there when a fictional character is mentioning other fictional characters. And Chandler mentions him in his essay, The Simple Art of Murder. Philo Vance is a really interesting fictional detective that was created by S.S. Van Dyne, and that was a pen name for a guy named Willard Huntington Wright. He writes those Rules of Detective Fiction in 1928 and an introduction and notes for an anthology of detective fiction. And his books were really popular in the 20s and early 30s. He had about a dozen bestsellers, like The Benson Murder Case and The Canary Murder Case, and they would have been on radio, and some of them were adapted for film in the early 30s. But his books and those films are now kind of forgotten. They're really obscure. Um, the novels are out of print. There's really no audience for them anymore because by the late 30s, hard-boiled was becoming much more popular. And the problem with S.S. Van Dyne's Philo Vance books is that they were rather formulaic and gimmicky. They had footnotes in them and they had dates and times and things like that. But the main problem is that Philo Vance is this amateur sleuth in New York City. He's a lover of art. He's a bit of a snob. He's wealthy. He talks with an English accent. He wears a monocle and he lives in a posh apartment. Think of how American audiences would react to that. And worst of all, he was this obnoxious intellectual, this rather insufferable detective, um, the essential antithesis of Marlowe. Although you can see Philo Vance's descendants in other famous fictional detectives like Nero Wolfe and Ellery Queen, but I think Poet Ogden Nash sums it up for everybody when he wrote this very short poem about the character. And he said, Philo Vance needs a kick in the pants. I couldn't agree more, and I think Chandler and Marlowe do as well. You should really pay attention to that chivalric code, this kind of social conscience that Marlowe has in this rather lawless, tawdry, corrupt world. It's his sense of personal integrity, his protection against everything that goes around him. So it's his code of ethics. It's a set of professional principles he has. It's his compassion for other people. Yes, he does have to bend the rules and maybe break the law now and then, but he certainly doesn't relish it. And he's not a fan of authority. He's wary of the police, as I mentioned before. And he tries to keep his distance from things, but he always kind of gets pulled in. But he certainly knows how to do the right thing. And if you're looking for examples of that detective code, I would check out his comments in chapters 18, 23, 24, and 30, where he really talks about it in depth. There he is there in the General's orchid garden. He's a bit of a reluctant private eye, I would say, a kind of detached observer who tries to participate in a disinterested way. He's trying to avoid falling in love, but he's also trying to be sensitive to the suffering going on around him. Certainly not motivated by money, but determined, and does not like to take risks. He's not stupid. And he doesn't appreciate trying to be fooled by anyone. And he tends to use things about, I would say, hyperbole and understatement. He has a real verbal prowess. So he's quick with the put-downs and the jibes and the one-liners. And I would say a strong sense of propriety, that sense of right and wrong. So we could call him sort of a paradox private eye. And maybe this is what makes him so attractive as a character, is this duality that is going on within him, that he seems rather pessimistic and bitter when he speaks, but then when he does things, he seems kind of romantic and quixotic. He's certainly a hard-boiled guy, but he's not a superhero. He takes a beating. He's knocked out. He's beaten up. He wants to be an outsider, but throughout the novels, this first-person point of view creates quite an intimate voice. This romantic sensibility combined with this concrete objectivism. He's intelligent, but all throughout his cases, he's puzzled by things. His clients, his women, the motives that people have. You really have to read this novel, not so much for the solution, but for the journey, for the quest. And as I mentioned before, he's got some issues with other people. He's pretty earthy. Lots of street slang, lots of wisecracks, but also some rather literary lines, like in chapter 9 when he says, "Dead men are heavier than broken hearts." That's a real epigrammatic line that he uses there. We have to talk about Marlowe and women. Yeah. As I mentioned, he tries to stay free of personal entanglements, but it's not easy. Throughout the novels, he seems to show a lot of disdain for women, contempt. They're a real distraction for him. He distrusts their motives. He's wary of their power, and when they try to offer him things like money and sex, he knows that that's rather a trap. But he certainly is susceptible to love. And he often gets tricked by these femme fatales, these dangerous women, trying to defeat him and thwart him and distract him. And some great lines he has there. "She gave me a smile I could feel in my hip pocket." Lots of sexual innuendo when he meets women. And even Chandler has some lines about him there, again about his detective code, that he would seduce a duchess, but he wouldn't spoil a virgin. And you'll notice early on in the novel when he meets Vivian, he says, "She was worth a stare. She was trouble." And that's certainly true. And that's an image there from the film when he meets Carmen in the opening scene. And there's a lot of irony in the first chapter and in the opening scene of the film based upon what happens later. I won't ruin it for you. There he is there again with Carmen. You really have to understand the femme fatale handout and the femme fatale PowerPoint there to get a sense of the kind of women that Marlowe meets. He really doesn't meet a lot of good women. And as he points out, they're often beautiful. A blonde to make a bishop kick a hole in a stained glass window. So beautiful in appearance, but as the other line says, a woman will lie about anything just to stay in practice. Rather cynical, rather bitter about women. So he has this rather complex relationship with them, let's say. So what we have in The Big Sleep is a quest. Marlowe is searching for truth, answers, order. He's this knight errant trying to follow the chivalry code, but it's a fallen, mean world. The whole world seems to be one big con game. So he's got this old-fashioned sense of chivalry, but it's a grimy contemporary world that he finds himself in. And he's got to make these difficult ethical decisions and often end up compromising his own standards of honor and integrity as he goes through the novel. So he pursues justice despite the poor odds and even the poor pay, let's say. And he casts a critical eye on society as he tries to solve the case. As you'll notice later in the novel, he comes across a chessboard and he looks down and he says, "Knights have no meaning in this game." But that's exactly what he is, like Galahad, Lancelot, and Percival. There's Raymond Chandler on the left with his cat and his pipe. Humphrey Bogart playing Bogey, or playing Marlowe again. Some more lines about what Chandler thinks about his character. That he's an honorable man, speaking like someone of his age would speak. The rude wit, the lively sense of the grotesque, which would really be something bizarre and freakish, how the people in life are distorted, and that's certainly what Marlowe comes up against. Doesn't like sham and trickery or pettiness. So Chandler had some serious thoughts on his character, fully formed by 1939. Let's give the last words to our detective. Like I said, the heart of the novel isn't really solving the murders in the case and all those other crimes. It's the most important thing about The Big Sleep is the creation of this character and the world he lives in that we get to, follow and listen to. And this is why I think he endures and keeps connecting with modern audiences. And this is another great line from one of the books where Marlowe makes this confession that he needs a drink, life insurance, vacation, and a home in the country. And he has none of those. All he's got is a coat, a hat, and a gun. So many guns. And that's a scene there from the film where he's dealing with Joe Brody and Agnes and a lot of guns. Oh, that's the famous painting by Edward Hopper, Nighthawks from the 40s. I always like to think that that painting there depicts Marlowe in a late night diner. Not the man sitting next to the red-headed woman, but the other guy sitting alone, probably having a coffee, trying to make sense of what happened. That's the end of the Philip Marlowe Trouble is His Business PowerPoint movie. Make sure that you review the notes on the fictional private eye to get a sense of who Marlowe is. I tend to think he has a sense of community. He's a bit of a negotiator, willing to compromise. This ordinary, fallible guy who's got a knack for communication and who is kind of socially conscious and would probably prefer to solve things non-violently. As he says in this novel, guns never settle anything. Thanks for watching and listening.